Welcome to Staffworks Explain. If you're here for the first time, please consider subscribing to this channel. In this video, we'll be talking about Lapsset Railway or SGR, where we say that Kenya must build the railway before it builds the hype. For more than a decade, Kenya has spoken about Lapsset, which is Lamu Port, South Sudan, Ethiopia Transport Corridor, as if the railway is just one item on a long shopping list of infrastructure. It is not. The planned railway is arguably the piece that will determine whether the entire Lamu Port South Sudan Ethiopia corridor becomes a functioning economic corridor or remains a collection of ambitious projects scattered across northern Kenya. The idea is straightforward, but its implications are enormous. A railway will begin at Lamu, running through Garissa, Isiolo counties, before dividing northwards towards Moyale and Ethiopia, as well as northwestward towards Nakodok and South Sudan. The broader regional plan envisages connections onward to Addis Ababa and Juba. The Africa's Union PIDA program describes the regional railway as approximately 2,900 kilometers, connecting Lamu with two neighboring capitals and beyond, perhaps. Kenya's own Lapsset legal framework provides for standard gauge railway link from Lamu to Isiolo, Ethiopia and South Sudan, as well as Nairobi-Isiolo connection. This is therefore not simply a railway to Lamu. It is an attempt to give East Africa a new route to the Indian Ocean. And that's why Kenya needs to have a much more serious conversation about it. First, what exactly is being planned? Lapsset Railway is planned as a standard gauge railway or SGR. Standard gauge railway or standard gauge refers to a track width of 1.435 meters and is widely used for modern intercity and freight railways. The Kenya section is intended to run from Lamu through Garissa to Isiolo. From Isiolo, one branch will head towards Moyale and eventually Addis Ababa, while another would head towards Nakodok and ultimately Juba. The 2018 Lapsset Integrated Transport Infrastructure Master Plan, drawing on an earlier feasibility work, identifies approximately 544 kilometers between Lamu and Isiolo, about 477 kilometers between Isiolo and Moyale, and about 755 kilometers between Isiolo and Nakodok. The precise length vary between planning documents because different studies have considered different endpoints as well as alignments. The railway is primarily a freight railway. That point is very important. This is not another Nairobi commuter railway, and it should not be judged primarily by passenger numbers. Its commercial logic is moving large quantities of cargo efficiently over long distances. Earlier feasibility work envisaged diesel-powered train with possibility of a future electrification. The railway would use passing loops, which are places where trains can move off the main track to allow trains traveling in the opposite direction to pass, because much of the proposed network was initially conceived as a single track. The 2018 master plan indicated a design speed of up to 120 kilometers per hour and a capacity roughly 28 trains per day under the CCECC planning scenario. The same study estimated that trains could take roughly 7 hours to travel from Lamu to Isiolo, with additional travel time to northern branches. Those numbers, however, should be treated as planning assumptions rather than promises. Railway capacity depends on the final engineering design, signaling system, numbers and length of passing loops, locomotive performance, wagon configuration, terminal efficiency, and the actual operating timetable. In other words, A railway does not become a 25 million ton railway simply because someone writes 25 million tons in a project document. The physical railway must be designed, financed, built, operated, and supplied with cargo. That distinction is important. Where does the 25 million tons figure come from? The 25 million tons figure has been used in descriptions of the planned Lapsset Railway annual freight capacity. But there's an important difference between capacity and demand. Capacity is how much a railway can theoretically handle under its operating design. Demand, on the other hand, is how much cargo customers will actually put on the railway. Those are two very different things. The Lapsset planning documents contain freight forecasts that were developed at different stages of the project. The 2015 CCECC study reproduced in Lapsset planning framework projected substantial growth along the Lamu-Isiolo section, as well as the addition of flows towards South Sudan, Ethiopia by 2040. The figures vary by direction and section rather than presenting one simple number for the entire railway. For example, that study projected Lamu to Isiolo freight of about 16.5 million tons a year by 2040, with another 9.1 million tons moving in the opposite direction. It also projected additional flows on the Isiolo Nakodok as well as Isiolo Moyale branches. So when figures such as 25 million tons or even higher future numbers are quoted, the public deserves to know whether the figures refers to the engineering capacity, forecast demand, or aspirational long-term traffic scenarios. That is not a technicality. It is the difference between a bankable railway and an expensive railway looking for customers. The real customer is not Kenya alone. The economic scale of Lapsset Railway, as we say, has always rested heavily on regional trade. Kenya is the host country, but the railway is being conceived as an international corridor. Its most important prospective markets are Ethiopia and South Sudan. Ethiopia is particularly significant because it is a landlocked country and has a huge population and an economy that requires reliable access to seaport. South Sudan presents a different opportunity. Its economy has enormous infrastructure and logistic needs, and its geographical position gives Lapsset the possibility of becoming a major supply route if security, infrastructure, and political conditions allow. Africa's Union PIDA program identifies Kenya, Ethiopia, and South Sudan as the principal members of the Lapsset Railway, with Uganda also identified among the beneficiary countries. The project is explicitly intended to support regional integration. That means Kenya cannot build the railway while thinking only about Kenyan cargo. The railway will succeed or fail according to whether Ethiopia and South Sudan find it commercially attractive. And that brings us to the central question. And the question is, why would a trader in Addis Ababa choose Lamu? The answer cannot simply be because Lamu has a port. The other ports, there's Djibouti, there is Mombasa, there is Dar es Salaam, there are the ports along the Red Sea, among others. Cargo owners will look at the complete journey. They look at the price, reliability, transit times, border procedures, security, availability of wagons, port efficiencies, as well as likelihood of delays. If the Lamu route is cheaper but unreliable, customers will hesitate. If it is faster but significantly more expensive, they will hesitate. If the railway is efficient but customs procedures at the border are slow, the advantage is lost. The railway therefore needs to be designed as a corridor, not as a standalone construction project. And this is where Kenya must be careful. Kenya has already made this mistake in the way it sometimes talks about infrastructure. We talk about kilometers completed, billions that are spent. We talk about capacity, but businesses do not buy kilometers, they buy reliability. A manufacturer wants to know when raw materials will arrive. An exporter wants to know when the shipment will reach the ship. A logistics company wants to know how many wagons it can secure. A farmer wants to know whether produce can reach the market before it spoils. That is why the planned railway needs a commercial operating strategy before construction reaches full scale. Kenya should know in advance which cargo will move by rail, from which locations, and at what price, as well as what volumes. The government should be able to answer a deceptively simple question. And the question is, who has committed to using this railway? Not who has expressed interest. Who has committed? That means serious negotiations with the Ethiopian importers and exporters, South Sudan traders, mining companies, agricultural producers, manufacturers, logistics operators, as well as major shipping lines. Lamu cannot become a port without a hinterland. This is perhaps the most important issue of all. A railway from Lamu to Isiolo is useful only if the economic activity along the and beyond the railway. The word hinterland means, or simply means, the inland area that a port serves. Mombasa has a large of this built over decades. There are factories, warehouses, transport companies, distributors, farms, exporters, and importers. Lamu does not yet have anything comparable. That is both its weakness as well as its opportunity. If Kenya builds the railway without developing the economic base around it, the trains will have little to carry. But if Kenya develops agricultural processing, livestock value chain, mining related services where appropriate, manufacturing, logistics parks, cold storage, as well as distribution centers along the corridor, the railway could become the backbone of a new economic geography. This is where northern Kenya enters the conversation. For decades, much of the northern Kenya has been discussed primarily in terms of marginalization, insecurity, as well as inadequate infrastructure. A functioning railway could change that, but only if people living along the corridor become participants in the economy it creates. A railway passing through Garissa, Isiolo, Marsabit, and Turkana without generating substantial local business would be a missed opportunity. The objective should not be simply to move goods through northern Kenya. The objective should be to enable northern Kenya to produce goods worth moving. Kenya should not build the railway and then ask, what is it for? This is where project management principles become relevant. A project of this scale requires a clear business case. A business case is simply the evidence showing why an investment makes economic and financial sense and what benefits it's expected to produce, what it will cost, and what could go wrong. For Lapsset Railway, that business case should be updated before major commitments are made. The earlier CCECC planning framework estimated the Lamu Isiolo section at about $3.3 billion, Isiolo to Nakodok at about $4.2 billion, and Isiolo to Moyale at about $2.9 billion. For roughly $10.4 billion across the three sections, including rolling stock. The figures are historical planning estimates and should not be mistaken for today's construction price. That point is crucial. The railway designed and costed years ago cannot simply be priced using old assumptions. Construction costs can be different. So are the financing costs. The forex rates could also be different. Demand, technology, the cost of borrowing, geopolitical environment, all can be different. So Kenya therefore needs a fresh, independently reviewed feasibility assessment before treating old figures as the final investment requirement. Financing will be the hardest test. This is where the romance of mega infrastructure project meets reality. The Lapsset Railway is expensive, as you have seen, 10 billion plus US dollars. Kenya cannot sensibly finance every proposed section at once simply because the master plan identifies all of them. The best approach or the better approach here is phasing. Phasing means constructing the project in logical stages, with each stage justified by its own demand, financing, and economic purpose. For example, the Lamu-Isiolo section should be assessed not only as a part of the eventual journey to Addis Ababa or Juba, but as an economic corridor on its own or in its own right. What cargo can it carry? What industries can it unlock? What port traffic can it support? What road transport or traffic can it shift to the rail? What private investment can it attract? Then the next stage can be assessed against evidence. The government should not be embarrassed by such discipline. Quite the opposite. It is how serious infrastructure programs are protected from becoming political liabilities. The railway must connect to the railway Kenya already has. There is another strategic issue. Lapsset Railway cannot operate as an isolated network. The regional Lapsset framework provides a Nairobi-Isiolo connection, linking the corridor to the Kenya's existing and planned railway network. Kenya law's establishment order for the Lapsset Corridor Development Authority specifically identifies railway links between Lamu, Isiolo, South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Nairobi. That connection matters because Nairobi is Kenya's largest commercial center and a major source of cargo. If the Lamu Railway is physically disconnected from the country's major economic centers, its ability to generate domestic freight will be weakened. Interoperability also matters. Interoperability means trains, signaling, loading standards, operating system can work across connected railway networks without unnecessary technical barriers. If a train carrying Ethiopian cargo reaches the border and the entire operating system changes in a way that causes delay, the theoretical regional railway loses much of the value. Customs can kill the railway. There is a tendency to think that once railway tracks cross a border, regional integration has been achieved. It has not. A train can cross the border in minutes and still leave cargo stranded for hours or days. Kenya, Ethiopia, and South Sudan therefore need border procedures designed around the railway. That means digital custom documents, coordinated inspections, advanced cargo information, as well as common procedures whenever possible or wherever possible. The objective should be one corridor, not three bureaucracies. This is where Lapsset and Africa Continental Free Trade Area can reinforce one another. Africa Continental Free Trade Area creates a framework for expanding trade across Africa. The railway provides physical connectivity, but neither works without competitive business producing goods that Africa consumers actually want to buy. A railway cannot create trade by itself. It can only make trade easier. Security is part of the railway business model. The proposed route also presents a serious security challenge. A railway crossing remote areas must be secure not only when it's being constructed, but every day that it operates. Trucks, signaling equipment, bridges, locomotives, cargo, all these, and even passengers all require protection. This becomes particularly important along the South Sudan route and sections of northern Kenya where insecurity has historically affected transport as well as investment. The answer cannot be to place an ever-growing security burden on the railway operator. Communities along the corridor have to have a stake in its success in terms of employment, procurement opportunities, local enterprise, as well as predictable benefits from the railway. This can create stronger incentive to protect infrastructure than security arrangements imposed from outside. Land and communities cannot be treated as an afterthought. There is also a human dimension that cannot be buried under engineering drawings. A railway requires a right of way. This is the legally secured strip of land over which the railway is built and operated. Acquiring the land affects communities. Kenyan courts have already considered questions surrounding public participation and land acquisition connected with Lapsset. That history should be treated as a warning. Unresolved land issues can become legal, financial, and schedule risks for major infrastructure. The lesson for the railway is straightforward. Compensation must be transparent. Community consultation must happen before decisions become irreversible. Grievances need a functioning mechanism for resolution, and local communities should not be left watching trains pass through the land they once depended on, while wondering what the project was supposed to deliver to them. Then there is the 40 million ton question. This brings us back to the figure that has generated excitement: more than 40 million tons annually by 2035. It is an attractive number, but Kenya should be careful about repeating it without qualification. The published Lapsset studies available today show that traffic forecasts have changed across different planning exercises. While the railway physical capacity and projected demand are separate concepts. The 2018 planning material, for example, contains detailed forecast extending to 2040 rather than simply confirming 40 million tons traffic outcome for 2035. So the responsible position is not to dismiss the 40 million ton projection. It is to ask for the evidence behind it. What commodities make up these tons? Which countries generate them? What percentage is guaranteed? What percentage is speculative? What competing routes were considered? What freight rate was assumed? What vast of volumes at Lamu underpin the forecast? And what happens to the railway financial case if actual traffic reaches only half the projection? These questions should be answered before billions are committed, not after. What Kenya should know now? The next stage of Lapsset railway development should therefore be driven by 5 things. First, update the feasibility study. The railway needs current demand forecast, current construction cost, current financing assumption, current geopolitical assessment. The public should be able to distinguish between what has been built, what has been designed, and what has been financed and what remains conceptual. Second, secure cargo before capacity. Kenya should negotiate binding and commercially credible cargo commitments with major users, particularly in Ethiopia and South Sudan. Third, develop the railway and the industrial base together. Industrial parks, logistics centers, warehouses, agricultural aggregation facilities, and processing plants should not be treated as projects that come after the railway. They are part of the railway's business case. Fourth, make the corridor measurable. Kenya should publish annual indicators showing freight volumes, train utilization, average transit time, cargo dwell time, operating cost, revenue, private investments, as well as delays. And finally, build in phases. Do not let the size of original Lapsset vision force the country into constructing every component simultaneously. Build where demand is demonstrated. Extend where the economics justify extension, and stop or design components where the evidence does not support them. That is not abandoning ambition. It is managing the aspirations. The railway, as we say, could change Kenya, but only if that change, the way it thinks about railways. The planned Lapsset railway is one of the most consequential pieces of infrastructure Kenya has proposed. If completed and properly integrated, it could give Ethiopia and South Sudan a new route to the sea, open northern Kenya to investment, reduce dependence on one regional transport corridor, and strengthen Kenya's position in continental trade. It could also make Lamu Port economically meaningful at a scale that goes beyond the port itself. But the railway must not become another project whose success is measured by the number of sleepers laid, kilometers of track constructed, or locomotives purchased. The real measure will come later. It will be seen in the factories that open along the corridor, in the agricultural produce that reaches Lamu, in the containers that move between Kenya and Ethiopia, in the cost of transporting a ton of goods, in the time it takes cargo to cross the region, as well as in the number of Kenyan business that become exporters. Ultimately in whether the railway earns enough confidence from its customers to justify the enormous public and private investment required to build it. Kenya should therefore welcome the aspiration behind 25 million tons capacity and the larger long-term projections, but it should demand the evidence behind every ton. But the most important question about Lapsset Railway is not whether Kenya can build a railway capable of carrying millions of tons. It is whether Kenya can build an economy capable of filling it. This is where the real project begins. So thank you for coming this far. If you are here for the first time, please consider subscribing to this channel. Also, you can watch other videos that we have done on Lapsset, on SGRs, among other projects in Kenya, in East Africa, and Africa at large. So thank you, and let's meet in the next one.